The cold wind blew through the streets of Maple Hill, a small town in rural Vermont, pushing dry leaves against cracked sidewalks and fogged shop windows. It was October, and autumn painted the world in golden hues. But for Joanna Carter, the season seemed to take more than it offered. Each fallen leaf seemed to represent another unpaid bill, another tiredness she hid from her children. Joanna, 36 years old, had a pale face marked by deep dark circles under her eyes. Her brown hair, once thick, was now always tied in a loose bun, revealing thinning spots at her temples. Her hands trembled slightly as she washed the same mug for the third time that morning. She wore a gray sweater already threadbare at the elbows, and her loose jeans didn't hide the weight loss of recent months. The house they lived in was modest, with peeling paint on the edges of the porch and a wooden fence that creaked in the wind. Inside, everything was simple but clean. There was the scent of warm tea and old books. The windows, although small, let in a soft golden light in the morning, creating an almost cozy setting, if it weren't for the growing silence between. The children's laughter. Max, 9 years old, was the quieter of the two siblings. He had dark hair that was always messy, curious gray eyes, and an introspective manner that made him observe the world more than interact with it. Ellie, his sister, 7 years old, was his opposite. Talkative, full of energy, with green eyes, and freckles across her nose. She made a point of smiling even when everything felt heavy. That Saturday morning, the two were sitting on the living room floor, scribbling on sheets of paper with colored pencils worn down to stubs. Max was drawing a fox running between trees, while Ellie tried to copy the cover of an old storybook. The television, turned off to save energy, was just a black rectangle in the corner of the room. "Mom, aren't you going to have breakfast?" Ellie asked, frowning as she saw her mother standing at the sink. Joanna forced a smile and nodded. "I will, sweetie. I was just thinking about life," she said, with a gentleness that didn't fool Max. The boy lifted his eyes from the drawing, watching his mother for a moment. There was something different about her, the way she lightly touched her chest as if something ached inside. She had been coughing for weeks when she thought no one was listening. Max heard. He always heard. The day before, coming back from school, he overheard two neighbors saying that Mrs. Carter was withering, and that it was a shame, with two such sweet children. Max didn't know exactly what withering meant, but it didn't sound like something good, not when it came to his mother. Later that same day, the heater stopped working. Joanna pretended the strange noise was normal, that it would go away soon. But Max knew. The house was too cold. That night, when everyone was already in bed, Max went to the window of the room he shared with his sister. The street was deserted. Only a lamppost further down cast a yellow, trembling light on the damp sidewalk. He rested, his forehead on the cold glass, and thought, "We're going to help her," he said softly. "Who?" Ellie mumbled, turning over in bed. "Mom, we're going to fix this." Ellie opened her eyes, sleepy. "With what, Max? We don't have anything." Max hesitated. "We have ideas." Ellie stared at him for a second, not understanding. Then she smiled, as if that was enough. The next morning, Max looked in the garage for something he could use. Among boxes of old clothes and a bicycle with a flat tire, he found a plastic box with a blue lid. Inside were his old sidewalk chalks, hard and broken, but still colorful. It was something. It was a start. "Ellie," he called, running back. Inside. "Look what I found." His sister ran over, her eyes shining at the colors. "We can draw at the square. Remember when you made that lion and everyone stopped to watch?" Max nodded, shy. "What if we draw portraits of people, like magical ones? $1 per drawing." Ellie widened her eyes. "But we don't even have a table, and people will think it's weird. We have the ground. And magic," he said, holding a blue chalk. "We have to try." Joanna watched them through the crack in the door, her eyes watery, but said nothing. She still believed in protecting her children from the world. Little did she know at that moment, it was they who were planning to protect her from it. The sky that afternoon looked grayer than usual. Clouds covered the sun, and a drier wind blew through the streets. Even so, the siblings went to Maple Hill's central square. They were armed only with the chalk box, a piece of cardboard where they had written in thick marker, "Magical portraits, $1, and an empty shoebox for coins. The first hour was hard. People passed by in a hurry, averting their eyes or giving quick, pitying smiles. Ellie tried to call to passers-by in her funny way, striking poses and saying Max could draw people's souls. Max, silent, focused on sketching some random figure on the ground, hoping someone would stop. When finally a lady bent down to see what they were doing, Ellie quickly jumped up. "Want a magical portrait? We promise you'll look younger then." "The mirror?" The woman laughed. "Do I really look like I need that?" Ellie didn't hesitate. "Only if it's to look even prettier." She handed over a coin. Max started to draw. With purple and white chalk, he made a version of the woman smiling, surrounded by stars and a little dog beside her, the same dog she held on a leash. When he finished, the woman remained still for a few seconds, touching the drawing on the ground. "You're talented, kid." And she left. Ellie looked at her brother and then at the box. The first coin gleamed inside. The sky was starting to darken, but for the first time in weeks, there was a different kind of light in their eyes. Max and Ellie woke up early on Sunday, earlier than usual. The sky was still gray and a light fog covered the town. There was no sound of cars or hurried conversations, as there usually was. Only the sound of the wind and the rustling of dry leaves. The morning chill seemed to seep through the cracks in the window, but that wasn't what worried them. There was something more important to do. "Do you think people will stop today?" Ellie asked, already wearing her brown wool coat, over her pajamas, impatiently messing with the ends of her hair. Max was sitting on the floor, adjusting the chalks. His fingers were stained with the colors, but he seemed not to notice. He was so focused that he barely heard his sister's question. "It'll work out," he said, with the same quiet confidence as always. He picked up a piece of blue chalk and started drawing a straight line on the wooden floor. "It'll work because it has to." Ellie looked at him with a shy smile. She knew Max was the quieter of the two, but she also knew she could always count on him. He was the type of person who even in silence could make things happen. That morning, there were no big preparations. They had already done the hard work the day before. They found the chalk box, made the sign with big, colorful letters, and even grabbed an empty shoebox to collect whatever they earned. All that was left to do now was go to the square. Max grabbed the box of chalk and stood up, stretching his tired legs. "We have to start soon before people leave for work," he commented, while Ellie put her hands in her pockets and followed him to the door. When they stepped outside, the cold morning air hit their faces, but neither of them complained. They knew there could be no hesitation. Whatever was about to happen, it had to be now. The square was silent like the rest of the town. The trees with their yellowing leaves seemed to hide the shadows of old stories. The bench where the locals usually sat was empty, and the shops around it had not yet opened. The sidewalk was empty, except for the dry leaves that blew in the wind. Ellie ran to the center of the square and placed the sign on the ground. The thick marker had written, "Magical portraits, $1, in large, colorful letters. Max was still organizing the chalks on the ground, separating the colors he would use, when he heard the sound of the first footsteps. He looked up, anxious. An elderly lady, dressed in a worn-out coat and a scarf tied around her head, appeared at the corner. She looked at the sign, then at the siblings, and kept walking. Ellie ran up to her wide smile almost exaggerated. "Ma'am, would you like a magical portrait? We promise it'll be better than your mirror," she shouted, almost jumping in front of the woman. The lady stopped for a moment, looked at Ellie, then at Max, who was already crouching down on the ground, staring at the chalk he held in his hands. He gave a small nod, inviting her to sit. "Magical portrait, huh?" the lady said, her expression a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "Well, you've got guts. All right, surprise me." Ellie skipped over to the shoebox and placed a coin inside, making a small metallic sound. Max picked up the blue chalk and began to draw. The lines were firm, but careful. The shapes formed on the ground with a fluidity that seemed to reflect his intent. He didn't know exactly what he was creating, but somehow he felt like this was what he was supposed to do. The lady stood watching, her hands behind her back, her gaze fixed on the scene. Ellie crouched down next to the portrait, her mouth open as if she had more to say. She held herself back but couldn't resist. "Max does this in a very special way," she said, her voice full of pride. "He makes magical portraits. He makes people see good things." Max didn't respond, but his expression softened. He knew that somehow Ellie was right. He wasn't just drawing the woman's face, but something more, the belief that they could change things. When Max finished, the lady leaned in and looked at the drawing. She smiled slightly. "It's much better than in the mirror," she said, and for a moment it seemed she had forgotten everything else. She took the coin Ellie had placed in the box and handed it back to them. "What else do you do?" she asked, turning to walk away. Ellie, her smile still shining, answered before Max had a chance. "We can do anything. We just need people to believe." The lady laughed, a low and soft laugh, and walked away, disappearing around the corner. Max stood up and looked at the box. The first coin was there, gleaming like a small victory. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "Is it going to work?" Ellie asked, still looking at the shoebox. Max took a deep breath and looked at the horizon. The sky was beginning to clear, and the wind, which had been so cold, now seemed gentler. "It will," he replied with the same calmness as always. "It will." At that moment, the sun finally appeared, casting a soft light over the square. The shadows began to dissipate, and the day, once so empty, seemed full of possibilities. They didn't know what the future held, but at that instant, they felt that somehow, something was changing. Garrett Monroe walked slowly through the deserted streets of Maple Hill. His heavy gray wool coat, draped over his broad shoulders, fluttered against the biting wind, which already carried the crispness of autumn. His footsteps echoed on the wet asphalt, and the sound of dry leaves scraping along the sidewalk seemed to amplify the silence that enveloped his soul. He had never truly felt at ease in the town, but something kept drawing him back, like an invisible force, almost an irrational need to find something that would make him rediscover art. Or, more still, the very reason for his existence. No matter how much he tried, he couldn't escape the feeling that whatever it was he sought, it was slipping further and further from his grasp. He lived an isolated life in his modern mansion, with glass walls reflecting his own loneliness. He was a successful man, recognized worldwide as one of the most important visual artists of his generation, but the art that once brought him so much joy now tormented him. He had distanced himself from everything: the art scene, curators, critics, even his own studio. What had begun as a genuine passion had transformed into a gilded cage, a repetitive cycle of commercial exhibitions and works that made him feel as though his very soul was disintegrating. The grief from the loss of his young son had been a pain he had never gotten over, but it had also been the dividing line that made him step away from everything he loved. That day, he found himself in Maple Hill almost unconsciously. He knew something was calling him to that quiet town, but he didn't know what. As he walked through the empty streets, he passed by the central square, and it was then that his eyes stopped. An unusual scene unfolded before him, something that interrupted the whirlpool of thoughts in his mind. Two young siblings were sitting on the ground, surrounded by colorful chalk drawings. Max, the older one, was drawing with the concentration of an adult, his gaze fixed on each line, each curve. He sketched. Ellie, his sister, with her wide smile and radiating energy, was talking to the people who passed by, trying to get them to stop and watch her brother draw. Max seemed more introspective. With his dark hair and observant eyes, he drew with a precision Garrett did not expect from such a young child. He didn't move quickly, but each stroke he made seemed to carry deep intention. Garrett stopped a few meters away, watching the process with increasing interest. The drawing was simple, a set of trees, a creature running between them. But there was something in it that was more than just a child's drawing. The purity of the scene, the attention to detail, the beauty emanating from the simplicity of that moment touched him in a way he couldn't explain. Ellie, on the other hand, was busy trying to attract a man who was walking nearby. She suddenly stood up with the characteristic energy of her age and shouted cheerfully, "Want a magic portrait? One that will make you younger than in the picture?" She spoke with a confidence that defied her age, and Garrett couldn't help but smile at the way she approached the passers-by. He moved a little closer, trying not to be noticed, but something inside him kept him from walking away. The scene, simple as it was, stirred a part of his soul that he thought he had lost long ago. The way Max seemed immersed in his work, and how Ellie used her sweetness to try and sell what was clearly more than just a drawing. It was a gesture of kindness, purity, hope. Garrett felt compelled to stay there, silently observing. Max finished his drawing and stepped back, his gaze fixed on the work with the seriousness of an experienced artist. Ellie, realizing that there was no one around, sat down next to him. Garrett knew it was time to step away, but before he could turn, Ellie ran up to him, her eyes shining. "Hey, mister, want a magic portrait? You'll see how it'll make you feel younger." She smiled so sincerely that Garrett found himself speechless. He hesitated for a moment, watching the girl with her innate enthusiasm and the confidence of someone who didn't know limits. Something inside him stirred. He didn't need a portrait, but it seemed impossible to ignore the energy of that child. He looked down at the ground where Max had drawn, and saw something that touched him even more. A simple portrait of a creature running, surrounded by stars, capturing the feeling of freedom and movement with such simplicity that Garrett almost felt as if he were looking at his own soul. "That's very beautiful," he said, his voice softer than he intended. Ellie grinned widely. "Did you like it? It's a magic portrait. You'll see how you'll feel younger." Garrett didn't know what to say, but a lightness in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years, began to take shape. He squatted slowly, unsure whether he was serious or if this was just an attempt to connect, to not feel so distant from the life around him. The sight of those two children, with their innocence, their will to fight, and their simplicity, moved him deeply. "You have a talent," he finally said to Max, who looked at him with a serious expression, but a slight surprise on his face. Max didn't immediately respond, but his eyes brightened a little. The boy didn't seem to know exactly how to handle the compliment, but Garrett felt that he wasn't someone who sought recognition. He drew, simply, and that was all. "You like this?" Garrett asked, not really expecting an answer. Max just nodded, while Ellie ran to grab a blank piece of paper to continue her own art, drawing a flower with exaggerated and colorful shapes. The world seemed to spin slowly around them, and Garrett, for a moment, forgot his own concerns. The talent, the purity, the magic of the moment. He felt for the first time in a long time that art didn't have to be a product to be consumed, but a raw expression of life. Garrett stepped back slowly, his footsteps softer now. His eyes remained fixed on the children as he moved away, and though he wanted to turn and head back to his mansion, he knew something inside him had changed. He didn't know yet what exactly, but that image of the children drawing on the sidewalk had planted a seed that he couldn't ignore. As he left the square, the cold wind didn't seem so sharp anymore, and the streets of Maple Hill, once silent and solitary, now seemed more alive. Garrett looked at the horizon and knew he would return. Maybe it wasn't just the cold or the loneliness that had called him to this town, but something deeper, something he wouldn't fully understand until the coming days. In the days that followed, Garrett couldn't stop thinking about the Carter siblings. Every time he found himself alone in his mansion, with the emptiness of his large home echoing in a deafening way, his thoughts would return to those small, determined figures drawing on the sidewalk in the town center. Something about those two touched him deeply, almost as if he saw them as a version of what he could have been, or what he could have been if his life had taken another path. He felt a kind of immense longing for something he couldn't name. He began making discreet visits to the town center, without being noticed, always from a distance, watching the siblings. During the mornings, when the market and the small shops in the center were still preparing to open, Garrett would approach unseen, leaning against store walls or sitting on park benches, waiting for them to arrive. Each day, he watched them, with more intensity. Max, focused on his drawings, no longer seemed as young as he captured the details of the landscape in his art. He had a natural talent that Garrett recognized. Ellie, with her tireless energy, ran back and forth, trying to attract more people to watch her brother's drawings. But the lack of audience was a constant obstacle. With each failure, she seemed unaffected, maintaining her smile intact. Despite her apparent confidence, Garrett noticed that something was happening. He saw how Max looked at others, as if measuring the interest and generosity of each person. He also noticed the moments when Ellie's gaze would drift away, searching for a comfort she couldn't find. It troubled him. They were trying, and that touched him more than he realized. With each passing day, Garrett felt an increasing need to help, but still didn't know how to approach them. He wanted to do something, but the pain of the past made him hesitate. Garrett had lost his young son Lucas years ago. Since then, his life had become a sequence of shadows and distance. He had withdrawn from the world of art, his career, anything that reminded him of the love he had lost. The solitude of his modern, empty mansion reflected his inner life. The pain never went away. The loss wasn't just of the child, but of family, of the possibility of happiness, of any genuine connection with another person. He was immersed in his own sorrow. On lonely nights, Garrett would walk around his house, touching the smooth surfaces of the furniture, looking at the glass walls that connected him to the world, but, at the same time, kept him away from it. He had everything: fame, wealth, recognition, but none of it meant anything. He began to feel that somehow, the siblings, with their simplicity and purity, were offering him a chance to rediscover something he had lost. Perhaps they could connect him with the humanity he had long ago set aside. Meanwhile, the Carter siblings were beginning to face the harshness of Maple Hill's early winter. The biting cold had already made Max's fingers turn red and numb, and Ellie, with her simple and light clothes, could barely keep warm. They refused to stop. Every time people passed by without stopping to see the drawings, or when no one gave them anything, they would look at each other and Max would just shake his head, not with frustration, but with a silent determination that was already beyond his years. Ellie, who always tried to stay optimistic, was starting to realize that the effort was becoming increasingly difficult. She tried, unsuccessfully, to talk to people about her brother's art, speaking enthusiastically about what he was drawing, but the adults, always in a hurry or disinterested, paid no attention. To little Ellie, it seemed like an injustice, but she never complained. It was as if, in her dream world, difficulties were just another part of the journey, something she could handle. But as winter progressed, the cold and snow became an increasingly insurmountable obstacle. Their greatest concern, however, was Joanna's health. In recent days, she had become more and more frail. The color in her face had faded, and the persistent cough seemed to never go away. The nights were long, and Max would wake up several times to check if his mother was okay. Ellie, with her innocence, thought everything would get better, but deep down, both of them knew something was wrong. Though they didn't know how to deal with it, Joanna refused to admit to her children that she was getting worse. She never wanted them to worry about her. Always smiling, trying to maintain a facade of strength and optimism, she did everything she could to keep the kids from seeing the seriousness of her situation. But over time, it became harder to hide. The weakness that was overtaking her body. She had no resources to consult a doctor or buy the necessary medication to treat herself. In her solitude, Joanna faced the consequences of her illness, trying as hard as she could to protect the children from a world that seemed to be crumbling around them. It was in this silent scenario that Garrett first felt capable of acting. He knew that to approach them, he would have to be more than a distant figure watching from his mansion window. But what could he do? He already knew he couldn't save Joanna's life, but perhaps there was a way to help without the siblings knowing where the support came from. The dilemma consumed him. Garrett started returning to the town center more regularly. He remained silent, just watching every movement the siblings made, analyzing their faces, their expressions. He felt that when the approach came, it should be done with extreme delicacy. But what he still didn't know was that, in some way, fate had already started bringing their lives together silently, invisibly, like Max's drawings on the frozen ground. On the cold morning before the heaviest snow was to arrive, Garrett decided he could no longer just watch. He sat on a bench nearby where he always came and waited for the children to arrive, as they did every day. He knew time was running out, and the need to act grew with every passing moment. When Max and Ellie arrived in the town center, he was already there, leaning against the same wall as always. But this time, something about his posture seemed different. Garrett was not a man who typically approached strangers, but the impulse was stronger than his hesitation. He stood up and walked over to where the two of them were, who hadn't noticed his presence yet. "Good morning," he said in a soft but firm voice, which carried despite the wind. Max quickly lifted his eyes, surprised, but without showing security. Ellie, with her open smile, immediately looked at him with curiosity, as if they were old friends meeting again. "Hello. Did you come to see our drawings?" Garrett smiled, touched by Ellie's enthusiasm. He looked at the ground where Max was focused on drawing a tree with deep roots and an owl perched on one of the branches. The stroke was firm, detailed, almost perfect for someone so young. "I was admiring what you're drawing," Garrett said, crouching slightly, as if it were a gesture of respect. "You have impressive talent, my friend." Max looked at him again, his expression serious, but in his eyes, there was something of surprise, as if he had never received such a compliment. Garrett's soft voice touched him in a way he couldn't explain, but he felt the sincerity. "Thank you," Ellie exclaimed, hopping around the bench. "Do you want a drawing too? I can make one if you pay $1. Garrett chuckled softly, and something in the sparkle of Ellie's eyes made his throat tighten. Her innocence, her confidence, it all made him remember moments he had lost, moments he thought he would never have again. "I don't think I need a drawing," he said with a slight hesitation, "but I want to pay. How much is it to see you two working so well?" Ellie smiled, excited, and immediately pulled Max by the arm. "See, Max, he's going to pay. Now we can buy more hot chocolate." Max looked at the man once more before returning his focus to his drawing. Although Garrett was not a familiar face in the town, Ellie's simple and genuine behavior had a way of charming people, making them trust her even without knowing what to expect. "You're good at what you do," Garrett continued, watching how Max applied the details to the drawing. "I think you're not just good artists, but you have something more, something the world needs to see." Ellie looked at him thoughtfully. "Do you think we can be famous?" Garrett almost choked on the question. He wasn't prepared for that, but when he looked at her, he felt a strange warmth in his chest. The simple trust of a child, trust in what she does without worrying about tomorrow. Something so rare in his life, so far from his experience. He wished from the bottom of his heart he could give them more than just words. "You can be whatever you want. You just need to keep doing what you're doing," Garrett finally said, his voice softer. He felt somehow that he had something more to offer, something beyond compliments. He moved away, not before giving a long glance at the small group formed there. An absent mother, 2 artistic children, and a man who now felt his life was connecting with theirs in an inexplicable way. Later that same day, Garrett made a quiet decision. Although he had not introduced himself as a stranger who could be seen as a threat to the family, he knew something. More had to be done. He couldn't just watch their struggle and hope everything would resolve itself. He decided that he would start helping, but anonymously. He knew that Joanna, the mother, would probably be suspicious of his presence. And he respected that. He had lost everything, and he knew how hard it is to trust anyone who hasn't been a true friend. That night, Garrett bought a large bag of supplies for them: sketchbooks, pencils, more sidewalk chalk. He left everything discreetly at their door with a small note that simply read, "To keep creating, you have something very special." When Joanna found the supplies the next morning, she didn't know what to think. It was strange, but at the same time, something about the note and the generosity of whoever left the supplies made her feel a flicker of hope. Who could be behind this? She knew their situation was getting worse, but she didn't want her children to know how serious her illness had become. The last thing she wanted was to place more weight on their already fragile shoulders. She didn't want to depend on anyone. But still, the supplies were there, like an invisible hand offering help. She hesitated, but she didn't have the courage to throw it all away. Maybe if it was something good, she should accept it, at least for a while. Garrett didn't show up later that day, but with each new encounter with the siblings, he felt that an invisible line was connecting them. He was beginning to understand the power of simply caring. And more than ever, he knew something big was about to happen. He just didn't know that the future, that future everyone seemed to fear, had already begun. The morning dawned covered by a thick fog in Maple Hill, as if the entire town were holding its breath. Inside the Carter house, Joanna struggled to maintain the routine. The persistent cough wouldn't go away, and the pain in her joints made even the simplest tasks a challenge. Still, she got up, prepared some porridge, and combed her daughter's hair with trembling hands. When Max and Ellie came back from downtown that afternoon, carrying another bag full of new materials. This time, colored pencils, sketchbooks, new gloves, and even a thermos with still warm hot chocolate. Joanna felt a knot form in her stomach. This was no longer a coincidence. She had ignored the first packages, thinking maybe a neighbor had left them by mistake. But now it was clear, someone was helping, and doing it anonymously. "Who gave this to you?" she asked, trying to sound calm, but her voice betrayed her unease. Max shrugged. It showed up again. It was leaning on the same bench as always. With a note, Ellie added, pulling the folded paper from her pocket. "Look, Mommy, to keep your hands warm while your heart keeps creating." Joanna read the short sentence and felt a tightness in her chest. The handwriting was firm, elegant, not from a child nor from someone careless. There was intention in those letters. Intention and affection. She smiled, trying not to show the storm growing inside her. But that night, after the children had fallen asleep, she bundled up, took the note, and went out, guided by a mix of suspicion and maternal instinct. Town slept under a silent blanket when Joanna reached downtown. The streetlights bathed the sidewalks in pale yellow. She walked to the place where her children usually drew, and there he was, Garrett Monroe, standing by the bench, staring at the empty pavement as if watching the trace of something that had already passed. "It's you, isn't it?" Joanna's voice came firm, slicing through the silence like a blade. Garrett turned, surprised. For a moment he said nothing. The woman before him, pale, thin, and with eyes full of fire, wasn't the frail figure he had imagined. She was a wall, a mother. He began, but she cut him off. "You're the man who's been leaving the supplies. The notes, the hot chocolate." Garrett nodded slowly. "Yes, I am." Joanna stepped forward. "Why? Why are you helping my kids without even introducing yourself?" He took a deep breath. The cold entered his lungs like glass. "Because they remind me of something I lost. Because I saw in them a spark I haven't seen in anyone else in a long time. And because I needed to do something good." Without expecting anything in return, she stared at him for long seconds. "I didn't ask for help. I don't want them feeling like we owe something to a stranger." "They don't owe anything," Garrett replied, his voice low but firm. "It was my choice. You don't understand," Joanna whispered, stepping back. "I've already lost so much. If I accept help, if I show I need it, it's like giving the world permission to take what little I have left." Garrett stepped closer slowly, respecting every inch of space between them. "I know what it's like to lose. I lost my son. An accident 5 years ago. He was 7, a sweet boy like Max. He used to draw on everything he saw. After he was gone, I stopped painting. I stopped living, really." Joanna felt the words sink deep. as if opening doors she had locked since the diagnosis, since the first day she couldn't get out of bed. "I'm sorry. I didn't know." "You couldn't have known," he said with a faint smile. "And I didn't come here as a millionaire trying to fix anyone's life. I came as a broken man, trying to see if there's still beauty in the world." Joanna stayed silent. The wind whistled through the narrow streets. For the first time, she saw Garrett as someone real, not as a mysterious rich stranger, but as a grieving father searching for redemption. "You were right about one thing," she finally said. "My children have something special, but I don't want them getting attached to someone who's going to disappear when things get better." "I'm not going to disappear," he assured her. "If you'll let me stay." She looked at him, studying his features, the weariness hidden behind the attentive gaze. "And if I let you, can you handle staying?" Garrett sighed with a bitter smile. "It's the first time in years I feel like I want to try." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence loaded with recognition. 2 mourning souls, each trying to keep upright what little of themselves was left. That night, when Joanna returned home, there were no certainties. But there was a beginning, a silent agreement, a fragile thread of trust starting to form. The next day, Garrett returned downtown. But this time Joanna was there too, sitting on the bench, watching her children with a blanket over her legs and a warm mug in her hands. When he approached, she didn't look away. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she replied. And for the first time, she smiled at him. Garrett sat beside her. Max and Ellie laughed across the sidewalk, immersed. In their new drawing, it was a heart with wings. The forecast announced the worst snowstorm of the year. In Maple Hill, residents were closing windows, stocking up on supplies and avoiding going outside. The sky had held a threatening leaden hue since dawn, and the wind blew hard, scattering dry leaves and pushing clouds toward the heart of the town. In the small Carter house, the cold seemed to have settled within the walls. The heater barely worked, and Joanna dragged herself through the rooms with feverish eyes and a pale face. In recent days, the pain had worsened, and now she could barely stand. Still, she tried to fake strength in front of her children. "You can draw here today on paper," she said in a hoarse voice, wrapping herself in a blanket on the sofa. "I don't want you out on a day like this." "But Mom," Max hesitated. "It's the weekend. More people walk downtown. We could make a lot of drawings before the snow comes." Joanna gave a weak smile, trying to suppress a chill. "Promise me you'll be back before it gets dark." Ellie kissed her on the forehead. "We promise, and we'll bring a surprise." Soon after, the siblings left with their backpacks and new pencil cases, bundled up in the donated coats. Outside, the wind howled through alleys, and fine flakes began to fall like a silent dance. Garrett Monroe watched them from a distance, standing inside his car parked discreetly on a side street. Since the beginning of the week, he had felt uneasy. The way Joanna hugged them longer, the way she walked leaning against the walls, something wasn't right. He couldn't resist and got out of the car. He crossed the leaf-covered sidewalk and knocked on the Carter house door. Waited, knocked again. No answer. The silence inside chilled him more than the wind outside. He turned the doorknob. It was unlocked. "Joanna?" he called cautiously, stepping in slowly. The living room was cold. The TV was on, volume low. And there, collapsed on the floor beside the sofa, was her. Unconscious. Garrett rushed to her, kneeling. He felt her weak but present pulse. Her face was sweaty, her lips pale. Without wasting time, he wrapped her in his coat and called emergency services with trembling hands. At the hospital, the white lights and antiseptic smell contrasted with the simple house they came from. Joanna was taken in immediately for evaluation. Garrett, standing in the hallway, felt his stomach twist with worry. But then he remembered Max, Ellie. He pulled out his phone but realized he didn't have either of their numbers. He left in a rush, guided by the growing snowstorm and the memory of where the children usually stayed. Max and Ellie were still drawing when the first thick flakes began to fall. The downtown area was already nearly deserted, and the wind now came in aggressive gusts. Ellie rubbed her hands trying to keep them warm, while Max insisted on finishing a portrait of an old man who had already walked away. That's when Garrett appeared, running along the sidewalk. "Max! Ellie!" They turned, surprised. He approached quickly, crouching to be at their height. "Did something happen?" Max asked, alarmed. "Your mom. She passed out. She's at the hospital, but she's being taken care of. Everything's going to be all right." Ellie started crying. Garrett hugged them, pulling both against his chest. "Let's go to my house. It's warm, it's safe. You can't stay alone now." The siblings nodded, trusting him like someone clinging to an anchor in the middle of a storm. Garrett's house was quiet and welcoming. The panoramic windows revealed the intensifying storm outside, but the warmth of the environment created an almost magical refuge. He made hot chocolate, offered dry clothes and blankets. Ellie curled up on the sofa. Max looked around curiously, taking in every detail of the modern house filled with works of art. "Did you paint all of this?" he asked, eyes wide as he looked at an abstract canvas in shades of blue. Garrett nodded. "Every painting holds a story. So why did you stop?" He smiled sadly. "Because sometimes when you lose something really important, everything seems to lose its color." Max didn't answer right away. Then he said softly, "Maybe the color comes back, if we find a new way to see the world." Garrett looked at him in surprise. Simple words, spoken with the raw wisdom of children. Later, with both of them asleep on the sofa under fluffy blankets, Garrett sat in the armchair across from them, watching. The sound of the snowstorm outside was muffled by the double-paned glass. The fireplace crackled in one corner. Something changed inside him that night. The emptiness he had carried for years since the death of his son seemed smaller. Max and Ellie didn't take anyone's place, but they created a new space, a point of light in the darkness that had consumed him. That night, as snowflakes covered all of Maple Hill, Garrett made a decision. He would no longer watch from afar, no longer hide behind pain. He was ready to stay. The sound of heart monitors beeped at regular intervals, like a discreet metronome marking the return to consciousness. Joanna blinked several times, trying to recognize the white ceiling and soft lights. It was warm and peaceful, but her head hurt and a knot of worry formed in her stomach even before she could remember why. "Mommy?" came the small voice, broken by emotion. She turned her head and saw Ellie sitting by the bed, her little eyes full of tears. Max was beside her, holding her hand tightly. "My loves," Joanna whispered, trying to sit up, but Max gently stopped her. "You fainted. Garrett took you to the hospital." "We stayed with him," Ellie explained with a smile that mixed relief and pride. Joanna took a few seconds to understand what had happened. Garrett, the stranger who had approached her children, the same man she had tried to keep at a distance, and who, in the end, had saved them. She took a deep breath. Her heart, though fragile, calmed down. For the first time in months, she felt she wasn't alone. The next day, the news spread like a breeze through the trees of Maple Hill. An article in the local newspaper, written by a journalist who had passed by the Carter kids' drawings on a cold morning, had the headline, "Children Turn Sidewalk into Art to Help Sick Mother." Photos showed Max with chalk-stained knees, Ellie smiling with her handmade flyers, and the colorful portraits that brought the town square to life. The article told the family's story, but also highlighted the beauty and generosity hidden in that childish gesture. And of course, it mentioned Garrett Monroe, the reclusive artist who, to the surprise of many, still lived in Maple Hill. The whole town reacted. An elementary school teacher started an online fundraiser. The owners of a coffee shop put up a mural with copies of Max and Ellie's drawings. Kids from school wrote letters to Mrs. Carter. A retired carpenter showed up at the house offering free repairs. And at the hospital, flowers and cards began arriving non-stop. Joanna, still recovering, could hardly believe what she was seeing. "I don't know how to thank you," she said to Garrett one quiet evening in the hospital room. He smiled discreetly. "You don't need to. Life just gave back a little of the light you've spread." 2 weeks later, an event took shape at the town's gallery. Garrett, after years without exhibiting anything, personally organized a show called Winter Drawings. The white walls, once filled with modern art, now displayed framed enlargements of the sidewalk drawings Max had made. Beside each piece, a short text written by Ellie described the person portrayed and the feeling of the moment. The opening night drew dozens of visitors: children, parents, teachers, curious townsfolk. Everyone wanted to see what the siblings had created. In the middle of the crowd, Max watched, amazed. "I never thought my drawings would be in a gallery," he murmured, squeezing his sister's hand. "And I never thought writing about them would be so fun," Ellie said, proud to see her texts on the plaques beneath each piece. Joanna, now standing and smiling, wore a new coat and leaned on a borrowed cane. She walked slowly among the works, receiving hugs, compliments, and kind words from neighbors who had never really stopped to know her before. Garrett watched her from afar. When their eyes met, she nodded with a faint smile. They didn't say anything. They didn't need to. In the following days, real changes began to happen. City Hall announced the reopening of the public library, where Joanna had worked for so many years, funded by donations and a new cultural program for children. She was officially invited to resume her position once she recovered. At school, Max and Ellie were now seen with admiration. Teachers encouraged both of their talents, and Garrett discreetly provided high-quality materials, online courses, and even a new drawing table, a gift left anonymously with a blue ribbon. The walls of the Carter family's modest house began to transform. Volunteers helped with painting, plumbing, and donations arrived almost daily. The garage was turned into an improvised greenhouse, made with repurposed glass, where Ellie planted flowers and Max organized his pencils by color. On a sunny winter afternoon, Garrett appeared with a proposal. "How about drawing something at the library? Mural for the entrance. You two sign it. It'll be the first official work by the Carter siblings." Max jumped for joy. Ellie ran to her notebook and started sketching ideas. Joanna, watching the scene, felt her eyes fill with tears. Not from sadness, but from gratitude. For the first time in a long while, she could see the future. And it wasn't an uncertain horizon. It was a colorful sidewalk full of possibilities. It was a spring morning in Maple Hill, the kind that seemed taken from an old postcard. The sky was clear, dotted with white clouds as light as cotton. The Central Park's trumpet trees bloomed with enthusiasm, scattering pink petals across the freshly swept ground. The air carried the scent of cut grass, damp earth, and sweet bread coming from the corner bakery. After months of cold, silence, and uncertainty, the whole town seemed to breathe again, as if winter had taken away not just the snow but also their fears. The Carter's house was no longer the same. The once peeling and dull walls now showed off a soft light blue tone. The windows had new curtains, sewn by a church lady who wanted to add a touch of lightness. In the front garden, Ellie had planted tulips, daisies, and lavender with the help of a neighbor who loved gardening. Max had hung a wind chime on the porch, and its soft sound was the soundtrack of that new chapter. On the newly paved sidewalk in front of the house, two small pairs of hands were already at work. "Do you think he's going to like this one?" Ellie asked, holding a piece of yellow chalk while drawing a flying bicycle with flowers for wheels. "He's going to love it," Max replied, focused on sketching the neighbor's dog wearing a detective hat. "He always likes the crazy stuff you make up." Ellie laughed, her loose hair dancing in the wind. She now wore a light blue dress with little embroideries, a gift from a teacher who was touched by their story. Max wore a white shirt splattered with paint and a red cap turned backward. Neither of them carried the weight of urgency or need anymore. They drew simply because they loved to draw. Garrett Monroe walked slowly along the sidewalk, his hands in his pockets and his eyes fixed on the children's creations. On his face was a smile that, months ago, had seemed impossible. He wore jeans, a gray t-shirt, and a light leather jacket. His beard was now more trimmed, and his eyes, once always tired, reflected a new light, a lightness, a rediscovered meaning. "These flower wheels are your invention, Ellie?" he asked, crouching down to admire the drawing. "Of course," she replied with a wide smile. "Every good bicycle needs to leave pedals behind as it goes. And this dog, is that Toby?" he pointed. "It's Detective Toby," said Max, proud. "He solves mysteries from the rooftops." Garrett laughed, shaking his head. "You two are amazing." Joanna appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame, a mug of tea in her hands. She looked stronger, more radiant. She wore jeans, a white cotton blouse, and her hair was tied in a loose bun. She watched the scene with a mix of tenderness and wonder, like someone witnessing a silent miracle unfold before their eyes. She no longer said, "I don't want help." She had learned through effort that accepting the care of others was not weakness. It was also an act of love. Garrett, for his part, never tried to take up too much space. He made himself present without intruding, made himself needed without demanding, and over time became part of the routine, the house, the family. Now he walked alongside the siblings as if he had always been there. Later that morning, they went to the library. There was a symbolic reopening ceremony. Nothing formal, just a gathering with carrot cake, fresh lemonade, and soft music played by a local band. On the new mural painted at the entrance, Max and Ellie posed for photos next to their collaborative work, a scene where children flew on books, soaring over a city full of colors, stars, and smiles. Joanna cut the symbolic ribbon at the entrance with trembling hands and tearful eyes. She was applauded as if returning from war, and in a way, she was. In the afternoon back home, Max, Ellie, and Garrett decided to finish the sidewalk drawing. Together, they completed a large, colorful mandala full of spirals, hearts, and little phrases written in crooked, sincere letters. In the center of the sidewalk, they wrote, "Here begins what no one can erase." Garrett took a photo and sent it to an old contact from a gallery in New York with a short message. "The best art I've ever seen is not for sale." And it was true, because that new sidewalk, colored by children's hands, seen by healed eyes and walked upon by now steady feet, wasn't just cement with color. It was living proof that pain can become beauty, that loss can make room for connection, and that sometimes all it takes is a handful of chalk and two brave children to transform someone's world. That spring, with the wind blowing softly and laughter filling the air, Maple Hill bloomed along with its people. And Max, Ellie, Joanna, and Garrett walked side by side, as if they had always been a family, because in fact, now they were.
If this story touched your heart as much as it touched ours, take a moment to subscribe to the channel right now. Here, every story is crafted to warm your soul and remind you that love can transform everything. And now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a moment when life surprised you in a way that seemed impossible? Share your story with us in the comments. Let's build a community full of beautiful and inspiring stories. Thank you so much for being part of this emotional journey with me. A big hug, and see you in the next story. I promise it will be even more unforgettable.